Hey folks, how's it going? Chris here from Monetary Games and Collectibles. Welcome to the channel. It's time for another Collector Thought of the Day. This is where I run a little bit more freestyle, just using my phone and my portable mic to share some thoughts from my life of being an adult collector. And naturally today, I want to talk about G.I. Joe Classified series once again. And I want to talk about this question. The thumbnail is the big giveaway, is G.I. Joe Classified series running out of steam? Is it coming to the end of the line? Although right up top, early on now, I want to be very clear that I have intentionally put that thumbnail together in the manner in which I've done to be, neg-heady clickbait for sure. Seems to me that these kind of more negative hot takes from toy tubers attracts more attention, so I thought I'd give it a try for myself. Because I think actually that's not the question. Is it the end of the line for G.I. Joe Classified? Is G.I. Joe Classified, the line is dying? People have been predicting that and calling that out for fucking years now. No, I think the question's a bit more nuanced than that, and it's a bit more about this idea of, is it less magical? Is it less interesting? Has it lost a little bit of its steam? I'm definitely seeing this sentiment coming through in comments that I receive on my reviews and on my coverage of G.I. Joe Classified. A cursory glance through some of the socials that I follow as well, like Facebook and Reddit, seems to bring this message to life too. So there's a kind of waning interest in G.I. Joe. In fact, I was just on a live stream last night over on TK Storm's Geek Room, and my man Voltaire over there said, he's found G.I. Joe Classified series a little bit bland, a little bit less interesting of late. And in that world of nuance, I think there's a couple of reasons for that going on. There's definitely a collector sentiment knocking around, you kind of vintage figure 82 to 87 traditionalists out there, giving vibes that the roster they're looking for is now nearing completion. I mean, what do we need? Like a psych out, a fast draw, a redeco, a ripcord, sneak peek. Is that it? Marine uniform gung ho. Muskrat, was he 87? Pathfinder, or was that a bit later? Anyway, it's nearing enough completion, for the kind of 82 to 87 traditionalists for sure. Those that are just looking for the kind of 6-inch version, the 6-inch plastic form of the vintage collection they had as a child in the core 80s. And further to that, I'm definitely seeing an additional sentiment that, the wackier, the weirder, the more neon, the more 90s style G.I. Joe is what killed the line originally, which, to be fair, it did. When did it wrap up originally? In 1994? And that as more figures are coming out along those kind of lines, it's just like too much for them in now. It's just not really of interest. And I certainly get that. I certainly get that. I mean, there's definitely kind of firm vintage figure collector nostalgia bait in the line. Look at the recent Airtight release. It's just basically a 6-inch version of the vintage figure, more or less. Flash is incoming. Your OG-13's about to wrap up. So there's definitely this kind of sentiment there that that there's a core fan base, a perceived core fan base of the vintage kind of 82 to 87 collectors who are kind of coming to the end of their time with G.I. Joe Classified series. Thing is, though, I think, and I often find myself writing this in response to the comments, that I think collector sensibilities have changed somewhat, and that while there's a little bit of a weird kind of marketing cadence this year, for sure, I've felt it too. There's no two ways about it. That has kind of meant new classified releases don't feel quite as much of an event, or when you see a full wave of 5, you're more likely just to pluck sort of 2 out that really stand out to you, whereas there were waves in the early days where you're like the whole 4 figures were like, wow, absolutely, I need this whole wave kind of thing. But I feel for the G.I. Joe Classified series team, I really do, in that respect, because there's just no pleasing people. They're just caught between a really difficult rock and a hard place. They're trying to acknowledge and build the line to suit that kind of wider accumulated G.I. Joe audience that has built over decades of output. So okay, you've got the core vintage figures that you would kind of label as that 82 to 87 that I've been referencing, but there are definitely fans out there who love their battle squads and their space forces and their ninja forces and eco warriors and all that. They were in the line at that time. And then in the world of action figure collecting, there's a few folks who comment on my videos who are Pursuit of Cobra guys. That was their thing, the Pursuit of Cobra. And they're excited by, for example, the new Duke, because it's kind of got a bit more of a Pursuit of Cobra vibe about it. Like in the comic book space, you got Real American Hero, you got the Marvel, you got the IDW, you got the Image, you got the new Skybound stuff that there's a proportion of us chomping at the bit to see. I'd love to see a Chameleon, an Energon version of Chameleon, and that new Diatech Major Madness or whatever she's called. What's her name? It's falling out of my head. Anyway, all looks really exciting. So you got all these different kind of comic book fans, Devil's Due Publishing, etc., etc. I'm still sat in the line waiting for a Quinn. I really want a Bomb Strike. I loved that period of time. Like Bomb Strike had some great little story arcs in later A Real American Hero. And the cartoons, I've seen some criticism saying, oh, well, they're serving the needs of the Sunbow cartoon too much. But there's been a good chunk of DIC stuff in there. And further to that, there's fans out there who came into G.I. Joe from Sigma 6, who came into G.I. Joe from the Resolute cartoon, the mini movie and all that stuff. I'm sure there's folks out there sat desperately in wait for Scar, for Iron Claw and bloody, what's the name, Steel Raven, and is it Inferno? There's folks probably out there still waiting for that. Video games, that's how Classified started off. It was drawing heavy inspiration from a video game. There's even probably folks out there who entered into the world of G.I. Joe through the movies, God forbid. They're out there, I'm sure. So you got this really kind of challenging situation for the G.I. Joe Classified, design and marketing teams, because how do they sort of tick the boxes across all these requirements? And, and then you got folks like me who complicate matters even further, because, one day I'll review a figure really positively because it's got a nice vintage look and I want to use it because, it's a 6-inch version of a character who was in the Action Force, and so I'm really excited to see it in the vintage form. But then the next one along, I'll complain about the fact that it looks too vintage, and perhaps it could have been a little bit more original and more of a reimagining. You know what I mean? And then I'm going crazy, happy over reimagined characters, or even the original characters, the new unique original characters they're creating for G.I. Joe Classified. So you've got all that kind of stuff, and then you've got folks like me who kind of sit in the middle, who just basically inconsistent hypocrites all the time. So throw that in the mix, and then chuck in the mix, the fact that folks like me are just up for a good 6-inch action figure to, get some man-child playtime in with. A good figure's a good figure, and there are now figures coming out from periods of G.I. Joe Classify, from periods of broader G.I. Joe, that I wasn't around for, didn't take interest in, but I look at it and I think, yeah, I like the look of it. It looks like an exciting, interesting figure for me to have some man-child playtime in. I'd like to photograph that. I'd like to display it. I'd like to put it in a dio, and so, there's definitely a proportion of the population who kind of are leaning out of their original entry point into G.I. Joe through Classified to learn about new spaces. But if you are pretty kind of hardcore, dead set on your G.I. Joe, your era or period or generation or whatever you want to call it of G.I. Joe, as the line is going on, the waves are now becoming sort of more diversely catered, so that a 5-figure wave has got one for, core 82 to 87 fans, one for 88 to 94 fans, one for a comic book fan, one for a Pursuit of Cobra fan, and then, one random geezer to top it up kind of thing, And so what's also happening now is that the delivery of the bit you're waiting for is starting to feel longer and longer and longer. You watch a live stream from Yojo June, or you watch SDCC coverage or New York Comic Con or whatever, and you see a new wave of 5 revealed to you, and there's only one that stands out for you for the space in G.I. Joe that appeals to you, that switches you on, that gets your juices flowing. And so it starts to feel like a little bit tedious. You're going easy pass more than you're going, oh, wow, I really must have, And then, I mentioned original characters, and you've got the crossover stuff and made by the G.I. Joe Classified, from the makers of G.I. Joe Classified stuff going on. So when you look at, say, a 10-figure line of releases, a row of releases, you might only be plucking 2 out of the line of 10 if you're specifically collecting it a particular way or looking for a particular, 6-inch revisiting of the part of G.I. Joe you want. And to be fair, the vintage 82 to 87 G.I. Joe Classified Series collector has been well served, as I said before. I mean, what are we waiting for? You're waiting for Iceberg to arrive, waiting for Flash to arrive. You'll want a redeco of Ripcord. You'll want a redeco of Psych Out in their OG colours. Get a sneak peek. You might find your head turned by a couple of slightly later figures like Muskrat or Spearhead and Max or, I don't know, Repeater or something. Or you might like a Voltar for your Iron Grenadiers. I don't know. But at that point you're done, and that's okay too. It doesn't mark the end of the line, it just marks the end of the line for you. It has lost momentum, it is less interesting, the magic has gone, and that's fine, just sort of step out. But I think there's still plenty of us sitting around, folks like me, comic book characters. I'm waiting for comic book characters. I want a Quinn, I want a Dr. Cassandra Knox, I want a Bomb Strike, I want a what's her name, Red Scream, a Pale Peony, a Billy, stuff like that. There'll be Sumbo fans, Sumbo cartoon fans, still sat in wait for the Maras and the Ravens of the world, Want to army build those weird clown robots. I can't remember their names, but, there'll be people out there waiting for that. And there will be, Sergeant Savage fans and G.I. Joe Extreme fans that are waiting for Steel Ravens, that are waiting for the Sergeant Savage, Joe Colton and G.I. Jane 2-pack, there's still space for some of us to take an active interest in the line. And I don't know, I just think they've shot themselves in the foot with this kind of weird marketing rhythm around things this year. The 2026 lineup is all but revealed. And, if you are waiting to fill some of those gaps, you're just like, God, boring. When sneak peek coming, for fuck's sake, I get it. I totally get it. Totally get it. But then I think about the G.I. Joe Classified team. I think, God, guys, banging your head against the wall trying to make everyone happy. You know what I mean? And nobody will ever be happy. Thunder Machine's not got the right front on it. That's a whole other conversation. Now, one thing in situations like this that I'm often reminded of is something that I picked up from another life when I spent a lot of time in the board gaming industry, in the tabletop gaming industry. And I think they stole this term from the video game industry. They call it the 70-25 rule. You might be familiar with it. I'll probably, kind of butcher the definition. But the broad strokes are this. There is 20% of your buying audience, of your community that is picking up your product, that will engage with the product outside of the product itself. And within that 20%, there's 5% of them who are hyperactive, highly active. So you've got your kind of 5% who are posting on Facebook, watching YouTube videos, making YouTube videos, posting on Reddit, out and about, really highly active. And then you've got, the other 15% of that 20% who are sort of casually dipping in and out, occasionally watch a review if they're a bit uncertain about something. Might make the odd post on Facebook like, when's this coming out? I've lost track, that kind of thing. Might look a thing or two up on the internet to see where they're at with the line. But then in actual fact, the 80% of your target demo, of your purchasing community, they will silently make their decisions, and they'll look at a new figure release, for example, and go, I like it or I don't like it, I will buy it or I won't buy it, and just get on with their day. So it kind of means in that broad space of things, you've got 80% of the people like, I collect some G.I. Joe, see it on the shelf in Target, I will buy it. Oh, that looks like a cool figure, I'll get it. Or it's from a generation of G.I. Joe that speaks to me, I'll pick it up. But you don't hear from them, they're not actively talking about it, they're not filling pages on the His Tank forums or whatever. Then you've got your 15% in that top end 20 who are G.I. Joe fans, who might, watch a YouTube video, casually follow reveal information, that kind of thing. And then you've got your 5% that are like, I am the G.I. Joe community. And they're speaking very loudly and very persistently in these spaces like YouTube comments and Reddit and, His Tank forums, etc., etc. But what it kind of means is that the 5% is amplified, and it makes their contribution to the sort of direction of opinion more amplified, makes it seem larger than it actually is, when in actual fact, they're not. That 5% is not fully representative of the information that Hasbro has when they're looking at kind of where their sales take place, how their sales take place, etc., etc. I think. I mean, I could be wildly wrong. I mean, I'll be the first to criticise some Hasbro decisions too. But I think in a broad sense, this is applicable. So I'm seeing these comments and this idea that the line is dying out or is kind of reaching its conclusion because the kind of core roster is starting to be done. But in actuality, there's still plenty of life in the idea of G.I. Joe Classified. It's just that it doesn't have life for you, So I'm not entirely sure the evidence supports the idea that the line is dying. I'm not even entirely sure the evidence supports the idea that it's losing momentum or losing steam because, when you look at figures that are proving popular, like in Ninja Force Zartan, a lot of positive talk around Ninja Force Zartan, a lot of positive talk around the Lara Croft, despite the whole pricing thing, which is, a whole other element of this conversation that I've spoken at length about, so I'm not going to labour the point now. But I do think there's possibly a dedicated collector base that is becoming more selective because that kind of core intro point, that body of individuals who are the vintage collectors who want to see 6-inch versions of their vintage figures brought to life in this new form, in this modern contemporary form, are becoming more selective and finding it a little bit tiresome, onerous, boring, waiting for those gaps to be filled. And I say this, of course, fully bearing in mind that, as I said before, this is all based on the vocal opinion of a powerful 5% and then another kind of 15%. And then getting to the clickbait thumbnail of it all then, within that 5%, that vocal, active, online community member 5%, we've of course got the toy tubers, the Instagram posters, and the bloggers who are of the more influential kind of positioning, who are actively taking, possibly disingenuously, but I can't speak to that because I don't know any of these people personally, but actively taking the kind of more negative view and promoting their content and promoting the more negative opinions actively because it's just, statistically, scientifically known to be better at generating engagement, better at generating views, better at generating eyeballs for your ad revenue, better at generating donations, because if you're speaking the language of a negged out individual who's frustrated now that the 82 to 87 roster's coming to an end and there's no more life in G.I. Joe Classified series for them anymore, well, that's how that rolls. So you've got all that in the mix too. So there you go. Just some thinking, but I really do feel for the G.I. Joe Classified team sometimes. I mean, there's just no way of making people, any move they make, any 5-figure wave they put out, someone has got a complaint. Original characters are shit. Why is there no more? Why are they not doing more comic book characters? Boo, boo, boo. Oh, Sumbo is, why is it always fucking Sumbo? There's only one vintage 82 to 87 character. When am I going to get this roster finished? How fucking long did I have to wait for Flash? It doesn't matter what move they make, even though they are desperately trying to cater to that wider audience of accumulated fans from decades of different outputs. I feel for them. I think it's really, really tough. I think it's really, really tough. And then you got dickheads like me putting thumbnails up saying "end of the line" for G.I. Joe Classified, which I hope I've justified my clickbaity thumbnail. I probably haven't. I'll have dislikes and argumentative comments for sure, but there we go. So I'll wrap that up there. I've been waffling on for ages, but let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Again, I'm not throwing shade at anyone. If you are an 82 to 87 fan and the roster is coming to the end and Classified's losing interest as a result of it, cool. That's fine. I'm glad you've got, a nice little collection that brings you joy. But I just think when you're throwing your comments around as the kind of definitive kind of view on what's going on with G.I. Joe Classified series, you're forgetting that there are folks like me whose interest in G.I. Joe is from the comic books, Action Force into G.I. Joe into, I've read it all. I'd love some IDW continuity stuff. They've not even touched that. Can you imagine a crystal ball with the crazy Charlie Manson hair? Would love it. There are people who came into G.I. Joe fandom from the later cartoons. There are people who came into G.I. Joe fandom from later versions of the toy lines. There are people in the G.I. Joe fandom who even became fans because of the movies. as hard as that may seem to believe. So there we go. So let me know your thoughts in the comment down below. Always interested to see what you guys are thinking and where you're at. But yeah, just I don't know, give the G.I. Joe classified team a break sometimes. Not every release has to be for you. Not every wave has to contain everything for you. You know, and it's okay to express criticism of that in terms of like sensible critique, saying, "Nah, easy pass. Probably going for these two because these are the two that speak to me," rather than that sort of very definitive kind of gatekeepery style of response. You know. Yeah. Anyway, there we go. Thanks very much for watching, folks. If you did find that interesting, then do all the YouTubey stuff, hit the buttons and what have you that help ToyTuber out. Otherwise, have yourselves a great day, have yourselves a great week, and swing back around for another video sometime soon. It'd be my pleasure to have you. All right, take it easy.